everyone. I'm Andrew Parkin-White. I'm MEF's Advisor on Mobile IoT, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Steffen Sorrell, who's the Chief of Research at Kaleido Intelligence. So in the latest research report, the eSIM Market Outlook, Kaleido Intelligence investigates how eSIM is opening new business opportunities for enterprises and mobile operators, and they're going to be sharing the results from this study that was published on December 2nd, and providing extensive insight into how active eSIMs and revenues across consumer and IoT segments are evolving, as well as analysis covering where the opportunities for stakeholders lie. So now I'd like to hand over to Steffen, and we'll ask him to introduce himself and his organization and to take us forward with his briefing today.
Yeah, my name is Steffen Sorrell. I'm here, Chief of Research at Kaleido Intelligence. For those of you who don't know, we are a market research company covering the mobile roaming and mobile connectivity landscape across consumer, enterprise, and IoT. I myself head up the IoT end-to-end side of our research arm. So we're looking at our past reports in that aspect involve things like IoT roaming, IoT MVNOs, as well as now eSIM, which covers both the consumer and IoT market. So what I'll be doing today is just to run over some of the findings of the eSIM report, which we published a couple of days ago. And that's going to look at, first of all, really what eSIM is, how it's going to develop across the smartphone and consumer industry, as well as the IoT or M2M side of the market. So I'll be looking at some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, and really trying to delve into what eSIM means for mobile connectivity in the future. So with that said, let me just move this window out of the way. So let's begin with a quick introduction on what eSIM is. For those that don't know, I mean, as you all well know, the SIM has been traditionally based on a removable smart card that plugs into your phone or your M2M device. This has worked fairly well in the past. It's been a good business model or a good distribution model for mobile operators. The challenge that has arisen started in the M2M side of the market, particularly on the automotive market, in that the issue with having to replace SIMs, having different connectivity agreements and so on across what is a global market for most automotive OEMs creates a challenge. So the GSMA's EUICC specification, which they refer to as eSIM, was developed. Essentially what this means is that the eSIM is a programmable SIM that can be updated over the air. The eSIM, so E actually stands for embedded, but eSIM doesn't have to be embedded. It's just a common term that's used by the GSMA today. There are two specific specifications for eSIM to address different use cases. So the most mature specification is the M2M specification. Yeah, this has been around since 2016, something on the interoperable side at least. And it operates on a push over the air model. Because these M2M devices don't have a simple, accessible interface, then a server will push an operator's profile over the air to allow a device to connect feasibly anywhere in the world. On the other hand, there's a consumer specification which is designed obviously for consumer devices, mostly in use for phones, watches, tablets, laptops, and so on. This was developed slightly later than the M2M specification, but because of the nature of consumer devices, it uses a pull over the air model for delivering the operator's profile onto the SIM card. So what that means is, feasibly, you could use your smartphone and potentially use an app to download any operator's profile so you can get connectivity. Those are the main functional differences. On the back end, the specifications are slightly different in that the M2M side has more components in it and it's more complex. So when we talk about RSP, we talk about remote SIM provisioning. So that's the process of generating a profile and downloading it onto the device so the connectivity can be used. On the M2M side, it's a little more complex than on the consumer side. So for M2M, all parties need to agree to a transfer of operator profiles. There's some integration that needs to be made, and it can be very costly and at the same time take several months to be implemented. You may notice that's already a challenge, which is something that I'll address later in the presentation. But how do we see the landscape, first of all, for smartphones? So I'm going to delve into some data, first of all. So the first eSIM compatible smartphones were launched with Google's Pixel devices, but unfortunately those devices don't have that many global shipments, but the industry was really catalyzed by the launch of eSIM compatible smartphones from Apple back in 2018. So Samsung has followed suit, Huawei now as well offers eSIM compatible devices, and Motorola even have an eSIM only smartphone on the market. So what this injection, this catalyst, has meant for the market from Apple is that we've seen now that there are, at the end of 2019, roughly 200 million eSIM compatible smartphones on the market. It's important to note, actually, at this stage, that eSIM compatible doesn't necessarily mean that the eSIM is being used. We'll get to that later. When we look at the market for eSIM shipments, so into the future, we are expecting to see by 2025 over 800 million smartphones being shipped that are eSIM compatible throughout the world. The majority of those will be seen across Europe, Asia, and Pacific. I think I don't need to say really that China is going to be a big driver of this market, as well as India as well. So when we look at the total installed base of smartphone eSIM enabled smartphones, by 2025, we are expecting to see closing in on 3 billion smartphones that are compatible with the GSMA's eSIM specification. And that's up from just under 250 million in 2019. So, okay, so we have this installed base. As I mentioned, eSIM compatible doesn't necessarily mean that it's being used. So one of the challenges that we see in terms of that, if you have a look to the right there, is things like regulation. So China specifically, the National Regulatory Authority, the NRA, has still not formally approved eSIM for use nationally across the country. And this applies specifically to smartphones. There are some cities that will support eSIM for smartwatches or automotive and so on, but for smartphones, it's not the case right now. So even Apple's iPhones are currently shipping with dual SIM trays and are not eSIM compatible. However, we do expect that to change by the end of 2021, which will drive the growth of the market significantly. Meanwhile, in part due to COVID, we've seen that while eSIMs are relatively well supported among premium device OEMs right now, the mid-tier device OEMs are not yet on board with eSIM. We expect this to occur from around 2022 onwards, a slight delay on what would have been the case had we not had this, this pandemic. Other key factors in driving traction for eSIM is that we've seen a tremendous increase in carrier support for eSIM. So when you look there, it was only 45 MNOs supporting eSIM for smartphones back in 2019. This is up to 160 at the time of writing, and it's increasing all the time. So the attitudes towards eSIM for operators is certainly becoming more positive to what was originally the case. So in that context, for many operators, I think the prospect of eSIM and the simplified switching that eSIM allows may possibly give rise to the threat of increased customer churn. And this is perhaps why carrier support for eSIM has been relatively slow to increase. However, as we will see, I think these attitudes are changing now, and there are certainly upsides for carriers, certainly on the smartphone and consumer side. Looking now at the IoT landscape, so when we talk about IoT, we mean traditional M2M devices, smart meters, automotive, sensors, and so on, but also consumer devices that overlap with the M2M world. So things like smartwatches, tablets, laptops, and so on. So we've seen the install base grow to roughly 220 million of devices that are compatible with eSIM in 220. Again, the majority of which are in East Asia and Pacific. The shipment forecast, as you can see, is slightly less favorable than on the smartphone side. I mean, while the smartphone industry has been affected by the pandemic, we've seen the M2M market, particularly automotive, far more affected. So I think between 20 and 25% year-over-year reduction in OEM automotive shipments during this year, which is why we'll see a slight reduction in overall eSIM shipments. But we do anticipate that for a number of reasons, so COVID being one of them, also developments in the ecosystem to simplify eSIM, as well as a strengthening business case around eSIM, that will serve to generate high growth during next year and 2022 onwards, which will mean that we'll see shipments for eSIM on the IoT side reaching over 350 million by 2025. So what that will all mean is that eSIM and the install base on the IoT side will close in on 1.8 billion devices by 2025, from roughly just under 300 million in 2020. I mentioned that there are significant drivers for eSIM on the IoT side. And that's coming from, particularly from a set of verticals. Make no mistake, automotive is still the key vertical for eSIM, particularly in Europe, where the eCall mandate that requires emergency services contact in the event of an accident. That's a very important factor in driving eSIM. But outside of automotive, through our discussions that we've had during the development of this report, we've had a lot of feedback where verticals such as logistics, energy, industrial, and manufacturing are all now looking at eSIM as a requirement in a high proportion of their request for proposals. There are many reasons for that. That's because eSIM enables, first of all, global connectivity. It also enables you to reduce truck roll when, for example, a contract is up with one particular operator and service is no longer available, or perhaps if an operator decides to sunset one of its networks, the SIM can then switch to another one. It's even important on the production line when you consider multiple colors of SIMs being inserted into devices on the production line for shipping to different destinations. It can be very complex. So if you're able to use a single SIM, you can reduce your stock keeping count to a very low level. We talk about the single SKU concept, and that is something that eSIM can enable. So that's very important in those industries because it reduces both complexity and reduces the bill of materials during production. Another hugely important factor is localization. IoT, traditionally cellular IoT, has been based on a lot of roaming and a lot of permanently roaming devices. And as we increase the device base, that's getting more and more important to operators. Meanwhile, you've got countries like China, Brazil, India, and so on, who all demand that the data that is produced by devices is not transferred across borders. So that means you need a server in country. It also means that you need a local operator to handle the connection. And that's where eSIM is hugely important. And again, another driver is the aspect of complex multi-country deployments. And I alluded to this earlier with the manufacturing lines. You have different colors of SIMs for different devices. That's one of the factors behind a possibly slower growth of M2M IoT on the cellular side than was originally anticipated. So I mentioned eSIM earlier about how devices might be compatible, but they're not always used. So we look at activation rates, and what that means is the device is eSIM enabled and using the eSIM for connectivity itself. On the smartphone side right now, it's certainly a very low level. You'll notice the green line, it pops up and then moves back down. That's because of the emergence of, first of all, Pixel devices and Google Fi supporting eSIM, and then the plethora of iPhones that come in that reduce that proportion. But really, as you can see, it's a very low proportion of smartphones that are using eSIM at the moment. But we do see that increasing significantly as time goes on, and reaching 43% by 2025. That's really dependent on consumer awareness and MNO or MVNO marketing. So that is one of the key requirements to increasing consumer traction, as well as the fact that contractual renewal cycles typically slow traction versus the number of devices that are available. On the M2M side, we typically see a higher activation rate. However, because of the various complexities that I touched on at the beginning, it is often the case that even where automotive OEMs have an eSIM installed, because of this complexity, because of this additional cost, the eSIM is perhaps not always used. So they will have an eSIM and either have another SIM in the device that's being used, or the connection will not be used at all. Another challenge is the fact that there's a lot of market fragmentation. There's soft SIMs available, there's non-compliant embedded SIMs and non-compliant eSIMs. And there's also the historical multi-IMSI SIM. So that's basically a non-standardized version of eSIM. And of course, you have iSIM, which is an integrated SIM, which is similar concept to eSIM, but currently none of those commercially available solutions are GSMA compliant right now. But you can see how there's a lot of fragmentation on the market. So how do we see the consumer market developing in future? So right now, when you receive your eSIM compatible device, the main way to activate the subscription is via a QR code. That's actually not that different to how the traditional SIM market functions. You go to a shop, you get your SIM. Now you just get your QR code. That's not really revelating for consumers. What we need is seamless onboarding. And there is something called the Discovery Service. That's an element of eSIM that's been introduced by the GSMA. And what that enables is fully digital onboarding for consumers. So you can use an app to choose your operator. And that will really dramatically improve the user experience for consumers in terms of onboarding moving forward. Another aspect is, and we talk about eSIM, and it's mostly just about connectivity, but actually there are upsides as well. So split billing is one of those. So we can talk about just having, if you have a look at the diagram at the bottom, just right now it's just a smartphone with an eSIM profile perhaps. But what you can actually do is bundle that eSIM with several different devices and bundle subscriptions in order to generate increased consumer loyalty, cross-sell or upsell services and so on. So there is a huge opportunity there. Meanwhile, when we look at the specification of the consumer eSIM, there is a lot of discussion going on about how to potentially expand the scope of that specification. So right now, we talk about consumer eSIM for smartphones, smart watches, and so on. But in future, we see that being used also for some M2M devices. So for example, BMW is planning to use a consumer eSIM profile for its vehicles as of next year. But we'll also see other classes of M2M devices use a version of the consumer specification to make use of that simplified mechanism for profile switching, deployment, and so on. So there's some very interesting developments to look forward to on the consumer side. On the IoT side, there are some questions. At the moment, IoT eSIM, traditionally automotive, and a few other verticals. But what about LPWAN, so low power, wide area network use cases, so your LTE-M and NB-IoT. At the moment, it's very challenging to apply eSIM to those use cases. You do have companies like iBasis and Nordic Semi doing field testing for devices across LTE-M and NB-IoT right now. But typically, the power consumption is too high. NB-IoT in particular is difficult from a technical perspective to download a profile over the air. So that is a bit of a question mark right now about how that is going to develop. Meanwhile, and I think I saw this in one of the questions that the audience has put in, there's the prospect of a GSMA compliant iSIM in future. So an integrated SIM that reduces the bill of materials, lower power, fully integrated with a system on chip. So there's no separate hardware required for the SIM card itself. That's going to be suitable for many IoT type devices. So in answer to the audience question there, the leaders right now are certainly ARM. Thales is heavily involved in iSIM as well, I believe. But in terms of commercialization, while we will probably see the specification finalized within the next few months, I don't think we're going to see commercialization of eSIM chips until around 2023 or later. So it will be some time before that develops. Another aspect of IoT eSIM is, first of all, applets. So again, the eSIM is not just about connectivity. It's about delivering new services, and applets are a key part of that. So applets can be delivered either by the operator, by the SIM vendor, or even a third party. And for instance, here, the eSIM can be used as a digital identity for easy onboarding to cloud services. This is something that will really simplify how devices are provisioned and deployed in the field in the future. Meanwhile, we're going to see a lot of innovation around the ecosystem. So I talked about how eSIM provisioning or protocol switching for M2M is a little challenging. There are vendors on the market right now who are innovating around that. So SI is one, for example. Telma is another, where they are deploying eSIM with solutions that really smooth the ability and remove the complexity and integration requirements to enable that profile switching, which is one of the key powerful aspects of eSIM. On the operator side, there is obviously a very high opportunity. So operator billed revenues, so that's talking about connectivity revenues from eSIM. We see that growing to over $188 billion annually by 2025, and that's growing at 125% CAGR between 2025. Shipment sales for eSIM hardware, on the other hand, we expect that to reach over $1 billion by 2023. And on the RSP side, so the remote SIM provisioning side, as of 2020, there are roughly 320 platforms being used for eSIM connectivity right now. Those revenues we expect to grow at over 108% between 20 and 25. So across the value chain, there is a lot of opportunity for eSIM moving forward. Okay, so that's my presentation. Yeah, I look forward to questions from the audience. Just a reminder that there is a promotional discount code for the report. I think there's a link being sent out to it. So 30% discount. And yeah, over to you again, Andrew, I believe.
Thank you, Steffen, for that very, very interesting walkthrough through your research report. Yeah, so we did have one question. You answered one of the questions that came in. Mm-hmm. Another one was, what do you see as the key benefits of eSIM for the consumer market?
The main benefit for the consumer is to have that flexibility in choosing your operator, and that's both applicable domestically as well as when traveling. That is to say that the market is very immature at the moment. So I talked about how the process of onboarding devices with eSIM on the consumer side it's still using QR codes. So it's not much different to how it was. So right now on the domestic front, yeah, are there real benefits for eSIM? That needs to be improved, and that is being worked on through fully digital onboarding. It will make things a lot more seamless for the consumer while they're traveling as well. Usually there are several options. You go and buy a domestic SIM, put that into your phone, or you just wait for Wi-Fi, or if you're lucky, you have a roam like at home package from your operator. eSIM will introduce new choice when you're traveling, in the sense that when you arrive at your destination, where digital onboarding is enabled, you can simply download a local profile and a local sort of data package for 15-30 days and yeah, save on a lot on roaming costs there.
Thank you. No, clearly a very impressive set of growth figures that we're looking at, and a key opportunity for players in the market. So what would you see as the steps that an operator, a mobile operator, an MVNO, etc., should take to optimize the delivery of eSIM?
Really, eSIM is about enabling connectivity on a global scale. So there's two aspects to it. I think the main one is on the IoT side, simply because of the volume of potential devices in future. Right now, we have eSIM support in many countries. It's still lacking from places like sub-Saharan Africa. But essentially, there needs to be a lot more partnership work going on to facilitate the simplified switching of eSIMs, and that can be done through hubs or connectivity exchanges and so on. But I mean, when operators consider the M2M market, even from a domestic front, customers on a domestic level will often have international requirements. And if an operator is not supporting eSIM, and that domestic customer has requirements in a country that they can't reach because A, they don't have agreements, or B, they're not supporting eSIM where they want it, then they will lose those customers. So eSIM is about really a very international market, both on the consumer front as well as M2M. Right now, I talked a little bit about how the travel experience can be transformed through eSIM. There's really very, very few operators right now who are specifically addressing that travel aspect for eSIM, and that's something that they're missing out on. There are, of course, niche providers who can supply tourists or business travelers with eSIM packages, but it really is time to be a step ahead of the game and go to where the puck is moving rather than following it.
Thank you. Quite a few questions come in while you were speaking, and in no particular order, I'll take them as they came in. You mentioned 320 platforms, RSPs, I guess.
Yep.
So do you have an idea on what the vendor split is like for these 320 platforms?
So the market is dominated by G&D, Thales, and Idemia. There are a number of smaller providers out there. So you've got TruePhone, Valid, and you've got a Turkish one whose name I've obviously forgotten now that I'm on a webinar. But yeah, the main platform market share is shared by G&D and Thales. First of all, Idemia has a slightly smaller number of platforms, but you know, these are not unique. When G&D or Thales talk about, or even the old SIM Alliance talk about the number of platforms in place, actually, when you look at the market, customers tend to use more than one RSP platform. So there's a lot of overlap that's going on in the market right now.
Right. So changing to a slightly different tack now, what do you see as the main fraud risks associated with an eSIM? Is given criminal SIM swap is an issue at the moment?
That is a very good question. I think the SIM value chain itself is, well, we have these specifications which are designed to be as secure as possible. So you have accredited schemes on manufacturing as well as through the provision of profiles. So I think on that sense, I think it's a little more secure than the traditional UICC format, but yeah, I think it will be an interesting landscape to look at moving forward. I don't have a specific answer for that one, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you. Next area, how will profile swaps be triggered on the chip with eSIM? Rather technical question. The GSMA SMSR/SMDP scenario still exist?
That really depends on which kind of which specification the eSIM takes on. Currently, you've got the SMSR SMDP on the M2M side, which is why it's quite complex. You've got SMDP plus on the consumer side, which is a little easier. But of course, then you have a local profile agent involved. So it really depends on which specifications eSIM will align with. So that is a question that we will see within the coming months.
Right, and next one is a rather long question. So down the line, when eSIM becomes more prevalent, do you see the eSIM returning more power to handset vendors? So with them going more directly to consumers with some great apps preloaded, or is the consumer relationship with mobile network operators already too embedded? And he apologizes for the pun embedded.
I think eSIM as a whole, and perhaps even more so with eSIM, when that becomes standardized by GSMA, really opens up the market to different business models. So when you have a fully digital value chain, then you can feasibly see that OEMs will sell connectivity directly to their end customers. That's something that's possible with eSIM, and something that's probably even more possible broadly for vendors when you consider eSIM. So yeah, I think certainly it will provide more power to handset vendors. It gives consumers more choice, and it will certainly make the market more competitive.
Thank you. And another area, so do you see eSIM as part of a smart home IoT device, or will it focus more on IoT devices which are not linked to Wi-Fi? I don't know if you have a view on that.
It's certainly possible to see eSIM as part of smart home IoT, particularly because smart home devices tend to carry a premium, which means that the typically higher cost for eSIM is an option. It really depends on the question of, is cellular the technology to use instead of Wi-Fi? And when you consider applications like healthcare, security, or energy, those critical applications where you want reliability as well as the additional security that cellular can provide, then you will look towards some kind of cellular communication. And I think, yeah, eSIM can definitely be a part of that, especially when you have a global value chain.
Yeah, yeah. And the final question I'll put to you, Steffen, and then you can take a deep breath. We've done quite a bit of work in MEF recently on global IoT connectivity, roaming, etc. So the question I have is, do you see the eSIM implying the end of roaming as we know it?
I think it's very early days for that, very, very early days for that. As I talked about on the consumer side, the market's very immature in terms of domestic MNOs providing eSIM packages for tourism markets, for business travel markets, for example. While on the M2M side, I think it certainly will reduce roaming. We'll see that as a result of not only eSIM, we'll also see it as a result of the requirements, regulatory requirements in country. I talked a little about that earlier. So data crossing borders or local operator requirements. There's also another aspect, which is we will expect to see a lot of LPWAN devices moving into the market from 2023, 2024 onwards. The real question is, will those be using eSIM or iSIM? Will they be using local SIM cards? And will the roaming market for those kinds of technologies have caught up yet? At the moment, NB-IoT is not in a good state for roaming, and neither is it in a good state for eSIM. I mean, really for those kinds of devices, for using the M2M specification, you need to rely on SMS to initiate a profile download. And NB-IoT is limited in terms of that. Limited operator support, and the initial specification didn't support it at all. So I think we have a long way to go before roaming is eliminated by eSIM.
Right. Right, well, I'd like to say thank you, Steffen, for a very robust analysis and a very informative presentation. If people want to get hold of you, I presume it's via your website is a good way of doing that, if they have any further questions.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, and Steffen mentions that their report is available. And as I said at the outset, we will be doing a blog based on Steffen's presentation today and the questions that came in, and we'll be producing that along with the video so you can share it with colleagues. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Steffen and his colleagues at Kaleido, and I'll say goodbye and have a good afternoon, day, evening, wherever you are. Thank you, goodbye.
So, goodbye.